On March 15, 2022, the World Economic Forum put out an article that was perhaps one of their most dystopian to date. The concept, 15-minute cities. And they are exactly as they sound. Compact, self-sustaining cities where all of your basic needs are within just a 15-minute walk from where you sleep. Now, don't get me wrong, some of these modern cities that are up and coming, for example, Saudi Arabia's The Line, is a breathtaking piece of both design and engineering. We also have the small forest city in Mexico. Again, looks beautiful. Biodiversity in Malaysia, Amaravati in India. These impressive cities will exist globally, but these aren't the ones that necessarily concern me. And if you currently live in a large, busy city, then perhaps this sounds really exciting to you. But 15-minute cities could be so much worse than anyone can possibly even comprehend or imagine right now if, and this is where the if comes in, the government running that city goes rogue. We've seen this in modern days, just in the last few years actually, where governments have taken certain actions which courts have then ruled unconstitutional or even in certain countries now illegal. But allow me to explain a little further. The Western media is pushing this concept hard, and I mean really hard, as if this is the solution to all of the world's problems. If we all just live in these 15-minute cities, then society will be perfect and all of these problems will simply go away. Where have we heard this before? Yet none of the Western mainstream media outlets are really asking the hard-hitting questions here. This World Economic Forum plan is happening at a speed which is even taking me by surprise, and it's my job to actually forecast and stay on top of all of the emerging trends of the future. So we need to ask these questions. Questions like, are there any downsides? Could this cause us to lose certain freedoms? Could we suffer restrictions on our energy and food consumption? We'll get to this a little later, because the answer is yes, yes, and this might surprise you, yes. But first, there's this concept going around as if the 15-minute city is something completely new and utopian, never even conceptualized by human beings before. Of course, this is completely false. Compact, self-sufficient cities have been around for decades. Heck, we could even say they've been around for centuries. If you think of a typical English medieval town, for example, you could easily say that was a very primitive 15-minute city. But if we start in a more modern day, we look at the 20th century, I could take you back to perhaps 1920, when Clarence Perry, who was an urban planner and sociologist, came up with this idea that a city should have somewhere between 5,000 to 9,000 residents. Of course, it wasn't a city that he was talking about. This was a community. And he said this community should have schools, recreational areas, and places of worship at the center of them. And actually, he wasn't talking about a 15-minute walk to reach these amenities. He was talking about just a 5-minute walk. And let's be honest, that doesn't sound that bad at all. Who wouldn't want to be able to go to work, run errands, do the school run, all in a very short space of time without getting stuck in traffic? I know I would. But let me take you to a more modern day example, because another one that springs to mind is Copenhagen. And if we go back to 1962, when they actually pedestrianized the city, over the course of around 34 years, Copenhagen became the pilot, as it were, the beacon for other cities to aspire to through this use of pedestrianization. And today, Copenhagen is marked as one of the top cities, if not number one cities in the world, to live in. Of course, it depends on whose surveys you actually read into. But is Copenhagen's success purely from pedestrianizing? And the answer is no, of course not. Now, I want to take you to almost the present day, and this is where we look at a professor by the name of Carlos Moreno, and he is the guy now that everyone looks to as the #1 expert on these 15-minute cities. And his concept is much the same as many of the others who we've heard over the years. The only difference is he talks about innovation and technology, and he includes bicycles and says there shouldn't be any cars at all. Now, since 2015, the professor's been talking about this for years and years and years, and no one was really paying much attention until 5 years later in 2020. And that's when it really caught the attention of many prominent organizations and figures around the world. One of those organizations was the World Economic Forum, and one of those prominent people just happened to be Professor Klaus Schwab. Yes, that man. But before we get into all the dystopian aspects, if you haven't clicked the like button, please do that for me now. It just helps the video to get bumped. And if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe. Because despite Moreno taking all the credit for this concept of the 15-minute city, actually, many of you will remember, like I do, something called the Venus Project from back in the day. There were a number of these documentaries that went absolutely viral, and they were just so interesting to watch. And this was the mastermind Jack Fresco, who lived to, I think he was still designing and working on this project up until about 100 years old. And I think the reason that resonated with so many of us was because he wasn't interested in profit. He wasn't trying to create this socialist concept. He was trying to create a city plan, as it were, although it wasn't a city, it was smaller communities, that really was optional. It was for people that didn't want to live in the big cities, wanted something that was more self-sustainable, but wasn't based on a monetary system we have today. He was actually very much against central banking. What he believed in was a resource-based economy, not a central bank economy where currency is created out of thin air. And what many people don't know is that the Venus Project wasn't just a concept. They did actually create it into reality on a smaller scale, which exists now in Florida. But I want to give the 15-minute city a fair look at here. So are there any benefits then to the 15-minute city that I can see? And the answer is yes, there are. Firstly, if you reduce motorized transport, you're going to have cleaner air for a start. And if you are forced to walk or cycle everywhere, then that's going to enable you to become more fit and active. And honestly, if some of these terrible transport systems that we have in the West could be improved upon, then I am all for that, because that means less time commuting and more time spent with the family, for example. Yet one thing I don't like is that the World Economic Forum is portraying this as in to say that if we had these 15-minute cities, the global lockdowns that we experience wouldn't be anywhere near as difficult as they were. And they give all of these examples which just aren't true. So they talk about how schools wouldn't have to be closed, places of worship, and all sorts of other things that they talk about. Yet if you remember back to this period, which I do very well, it didn't make any difference. Certain places, like churches for example, were deemed non-essential, while you had things like gambling and liquor stores which were deemed essential. I mean, it didn't make any sense. And whether you live in a 15-minute city or not, nothing's going to change here. So sure, the 15-minute city does have some benefits. I'm not denying that. But what do the people think of 15-minute cities? Well, I want to give you a really clear example, which many of you will remember I talked about on the channel a while ago, and that is the city of Oxford in England. Now we need to go back to 2022 when they launched their LTN, their low traffic neighborhoods, because there's a big difference between concept and reality, as they found out, the residents did the hard way. So you had a number of residents were really for this, pushing it hard, restricting motorized vehicles from certain roads at certain times. There were cameras and bollards and all sorts of, I mean, the whole thing was quite crazy. So the people, this is where the irony comes in, the people who were pushing so hard for these schemes were some of the exact same people that were then trying to appeal to remove the schemes that they voted for in the first place. And it only got worse in 2024 when Oxford City Council decided to add 6 more areas to this scheme. And this is despite 75%, we actually have the statistics from the survey, 75% of residents and business owners didn't want to. They appealed on these surveys. They appealed against this scheme. And this was for various reasons. People couldn't get their kids to school at certain times. Certain people worked shifts, and when they needed to drive down these roads, they weren't permitted to. There were certain permits that you could have, so you were only allowed so many of these permits for, whatever the period was. It was a nightmare, because remember, we're all human beings, and what do human beings do? We take the path of least resistance. So if you've got a choice between getting a permit to go and visit a certain store, or you just go to another store, what are people going to do? Again, they take the easiest option. So if you want the accurate data on this, there were 2,400 people involved in this survey. 63% immediately objected to the scheme. 11% expressed concern over the scheme, and only 26% thought that the scheme was okay. Another dystopian aspect that came out later on was the tracking of people's license plates via the security cameras, which is an obvious breach of people's privacy. And all of this data was uploaded to a data center somewhere, we don't exactly know where and why they're using this data. Despite a petition being launched to the Oxford Council with thousands and thousands of signatures, the council basically ignored it and decided to push ahead in the middle of 2023. And what I find interesting about this LTN, as well as some of these other programs that are in force at the moment, there's another one, ULEZ in London and many around the world, is that if you've ever seen the movie called In Time, starring Justin Timberlake, this is exactly what they had in this movie. They had different zones, and the further you went into the zones, the better the areas became. You had these super rich areas, the 0.1%, and then at the other end you had the people that were basically living in poverty. And if you had the right amount of credits, you could move between the zones. I mean, I know it's a far out example here, but this is what this dystopian measure actually reminds me of. If this is just the trial that, if successful, is going to be enacted into other cities around the world. If you get a dystopian leadership in charge of these cities, quite honestly, you're in big trouble. There's still a lot of questions that are yet to be answered. I mean, you just look at HS2 as an example in the UK, which has become an absolute disaster. Years over what it should be. £60 billion is now the budget. It's way over budget. And the government has come out and said it might not be practical to even finish the project. I mean, this is the craziness that we have in just one small Western country here. But of course, the World Economic Forum has a plan for this as well. And they say that in the future, and they're talking about by the year 2030, this is where their big tagline comes in that you'll have no doubt heard many times before: you will own nothing and be happy. And for those skeptics among you who say these 15-minute cities, they're never going to happen, well, let me ask you this question. Have you ever heard of C40 cities? Because there are 97 of these cities that currently exist around the world. And again, don't get me wrong, some of these cities are very enviable. They are nice cities to live in. However, if you look at some of the cities championed by the C40 network of mayors, LA, Paris, London, for example, the promotional material and the videos and all the other stuff that they make and the surveys is completely skewed. They completely omit the fact that yes, you can have an amazing life in these cities if you're in the top 0.1% or even the 1%. But if you're in the other 99%, then it's a very difficult and hard life. Look at Dubai, another city that they often talk about. Sure, it's extremely luxurious if you have the money, but if you're one of the foreign workers from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or any of these other sort of countries, you ask them how great it is living in Dubai and you'll get a very different answer. Now, a car-free environment might sound good to many people. But it does have a lot of practical challenges when you look at the fact that most Americans work in a company that has more than 500 employees. Now, you look at these concepts of how people are going to work in bookshops in the middle of the 15-minute city and coffee shops and other things, and you look at the size of the city, it just doesn't quite make sense. This is where the World Economic Forum again has the solution. Well, what are we going to do? Well, people are going to work from home. You've also got AI and robotics and automation. These things are going to take the hard work out of all of this for you, so you don't need to commute to your warehouse or to your office space or wherever it is that you work. And then again, it raises the question, well, what are people going to do then? Again, they have the answer. You need to upskill. And if you don't upskill, don't worry, we have something called a universal basic income for those people who, and I quote, get left behind. Again, these are all actual statements and quotes from the WEF, but I just can't see a solution to the work aspect. I was reading a recent survey and it said that if you are a low income earner, then you're twice as likely to get a job if you actually have a vehicle. Another statistic is that only around 30% of jobs can be accessed by public transportation. But even putting all of these aspects to the side here, there is another thing I want to mention, which is the really dystopian aspect, which I alluded to earlier. C40 cities, aka 15-minute cities, have already signed up to the concept of a planetary health diet. This actually involves reducing meat consumption to just 300 grams per week and dairy consumption to 250 grams per day. If you live in a C40 city, they also want to implement a calorie cap on the food that you eat, and this cap will be set at 2,500 calories per day. Why, you might ask? It's to increase your health and reduce obesity, because they claim that by people being obese that you are actually being irresponsible. Again, their words, not mine. They're saying that you are adding to societal burdens and also the burden on the healthcare systems. Now, even putting this aside and ask the question, how could they even enforce this 2,500 calories per day and the meat and the dairy and anything else that's going to come in later on? Well, to me, it's quite obvious. There's only one way. It would be to stop people at the checkout. And this is where the programmable currency comes in that I mentioned earlier. And don't forget, these mayors of these C40 cities are not democratically elected. They just decide to make these changes, and that's basically what happens. They're not voted on by the people. Now, this reminds me of another movie, which wasn't a popular movie, but I thought it was quite enlightening, and it was called Equilibrium, where the people that lived inside the city were very heavily controlled and oppressed, although they didn't realize they were, and the people that lived outside the city really didn't have much of a life. It was a daily struggle for survival. And I think that could be quite possibly the worst case scenario that could occur from these new concepts. And although some of you might think that Neo is completely against these cities, he would never live in one, that's not actually the case. I do think that you have two things occurring at the same time here. You have a utopian aspect, which looks very positive, where if you have a good government, they could actually create these utopian societies. But on the other side, you have these dystopian governments, which are pushing through things at a rapid rate. So whatever your views are on the 15-minute city, and I encourage you to do your own research, my only closing suggestion would be, or any of these three-letter organizations, really think for yourself, do your own research, and then make an informed decision. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts on the 15-minute city. Make sure to click that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know if you would like more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.